Greetings, I'm Pastor Diana Thompson. I'm the administrative pastor at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Alliance, Ohio. Welcome, and I am excited to have you here for the 41st episode of the Bible study of the Gospel according to Luke. If you've come across this video randomly, welcome. As I mentioned, we are on our 41st episode, so I invite you to go to my YouTube channel and catch up. But you are welcome to watch this video before you go back and watch the other ones. For those of you who have been joining me throughout this series, welcome back. As always, it is my joy and pleasure to welcome all of you. Before we go any further, I invite you to have a few items available. First, a Bible, translation of your choice, printed or digital, whatever you have available, whatever you can get access to, I encourage you to have one. I also encourage you to have a notepad and a pen or pencil. And I encourage you to have that so you can write thoughts, comments, reflections, inspirations, whatever is going on in your mind as you're going through this Bible study. And I also invite you then to share those thoughts, reflections, questions, and the comments on the YouTube channel, or you can reach out to me directly on my email or on my social media, which you'll see posted at the end of this video. So again, I encourage you to have those resources. If you need to pause the video to go collect them, do so now and then come on back. So again, in today's episode, we are in chapter 20 of Luke's Gospel. Jesus is in Jerusalem teaching in the temple, and we are going to touch on three stories. First, in chapter 20, verses 27 to 40, Jesus is being questioned about the resurrection. Then Jesus asks a question about the Son of David. And then that's chapter 20, verses 41 through 44. And then we'll conclude with Jesus denouncing the Scribes in chapter 20, verse 45 to 47. And that'll actually conclude chapter 20. So welcome and thank you for being here. As is my tradition, I like to review the themes that run throughout Luke's Gospel and also then into the book of Acts as they are written by the same author. First, God's redemptive purposes. Second, salvation for all alike. Third, the blessings of poverty and the dangers of wealth. Fourth, table fellowship. Fifth, the role of a disciple. And sixth, the importance of an accurate witness. So those are the themes that we may or may not be touching on throughout these stories. As you've seen throughout this study, not every story touches on all those themes. They weave in and out as Luke writes his story and narrates and explains this Christ character, this Messiah, to a listening and reading community. So this is Luke's themes that we will see repeated in and out of our stories. So our first interaction for today's study is Jesus being questioned about the resurrection. This is chapter 20, verses 27 through 40. And in this story, we will actually see the Sadducees for the first and only time in Luke's Gospel. So listen for that, and then I'll tell you a little bit about who the Sadducees are and why it's interesting that Luke included them at all in his gospel. So again, starting at chapter 20, verse 27. Some Sadducees, those who say there is no resurrection, came to Jesus and asked him a question. Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, leaving a wife but no children, the man shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first married and died childless. Then the second and the third married her. And so in the same way all 7 died childless. Finally the women also died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife will the woman be? For 7 had married her. Jesus said to them, those who belong to this age and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy of a place in that age and in the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. Indeed, they cannot die anymore because they are like angels and are children of God, being children of the resurrection. And the fact that the dead were raised, Moses himself showed in the story about the bush, where he speaks of the Lord, of the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now, if he is God not of the dead, but of the living, for to him all of them are alive. Then some of the scribes answered, "Teacher, you have spoken well." For they no longer dared to ask him another question. So this is a challenge to Jesus, but not a challenge in the way that the chief priests and the scribes and the elders, the Sanhedrin, have been challenging Jesus. The Sadducees have no authority for arrest. They have no authority to evict Jesus as a teacher, but they are a sect of Judaism that believed there was no resurrection. And so the fact that they're introduced in here is interesting. And maybe that is more the challenge of, those Sadducees and the Pharisees, because the Pharisees did believe in a resurrection. That Jesus is caught then in this internal conflict in the Jewish community between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. But it's interesting because there's no indication that the Sadducees were out to trap Jesus in any way. But they definitely said there's no resurrection, and now refer to an ancient law, which I'll talk about in just a moment. So they're asking Jesus basically to say, how does this work? What does this all mean? And of course, Jesus, using his wit and his insight, silenced those Sadducees by taking the scripture and reflecting on it with them. So as I mentioned, the Sadducees were a Jewish group that were often aligned with the aristocracy and the priestly classes. But they actually have no writings that have been found, and very little is known about them. So the only knowledge we have of the Sadducees comes from references in the historian Josephus, and then in the New Testament, and we see them especially in Matthew and the book of Acts. And then there's some references to them in later rabbinical writings. But the name Sadducee goes back to Zadok, the chief priest at the time of David and Solomon. Nevertheless, the earliest reference to the Sadducees in the historian Josephus' writing describes their activity during the time of John Hyrcanus, which was 135 to 104 BCE, so before Christ. In contrast to the Pharisees, the Sadducees rejected the authority of oral tradition, denied the belief in resurrection and angels, and emphasized free will over determinism. Their views on the authority of the prophetic writings, their openness to Hellenism, and the nature of their relationship to the priests are all debated. So what we know is very little, and what we know is not even solid. So the Sadducees in this story are introduced as the ones that say there's no resurrection. That is exactly how Luke describes them in verse 27. So clearly their question to Jesus is about how do you justify this understanding of resurrection by asking what is truly an outrageous question. If they don't believe in resurrection, then it doesn't matter what Jesus says about who this woman is married to. But yet Luke somehow, because of how they're placed here, seems to align them with the leaders of the people. But clearly, they're also not sure about all that's going on and why Luke introduces them. But it does place a piece of information in our understanding because it enables the readers, us, to see their question, and it is designed to reduce belief in resurrection to the point of absurdity. So again, this question of resurrection is actually an attempt to undermine this understanding of resurrection, that how can this be if this is what's happening? Now, the Sadducees actually aren't wrong in what they're saying in regards to one brother marrying his other brother's wife if there's no children from that marriage. It actually is part of the Old Testament law, and it's in Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10. So this is really important. So they're asking a question that really does have to do with Old Testament law and Old Testament understanding. And of course, this was also written when there was no understanding of resurrection. And there's still many Jewish communities today who do not believe in a resurrection. So we as Christians have moved in a different direction. And there are part of the Jewish community that believe in resurrection and part that does not, as I'd mentioned. So there's this challenge, this struggle, even within the Jewish community. So what the Sadducees are arguing with Jesus about is this practice of, it's called Laverite marriage, okay? And the Laverite comes from the Latin word lavere, which means brother-in-law, okay? So this legal precedent of a man who dies without children, his widow being married by one of his brothers, is not uncommon. And it wasn't uncommon in other parts of the Middle East at that time. And it's even written in Hittite codes and Middle Assyrian law codes as well. So let's go back a little bit. So when the Israelites, and some still do not believe that there is a resurrection, then the only way for someone to live on was through the lives of their descendants and the memories that are shared from one generation to the next. So if a man dies without children, then the law says his brother is obligated to take his wife and have children by her in the name of the deceased brother, so that his brother is not forgotten, that there is a descendant to remember him and to share and hold him to keep his memory alive for others. So this is what's going on here. So the provision of children also was a way to make sure that property remained in the immediate family, and it also gave security to the brother's widow. So this is also helpful to the widow so that she is not left abandoned, that there is a familial obligation to her. Now there's a few places where you will see this mentioned. As I mentioned, the law itself is in Deuteronomy 25, verse 5 through 10. But we also see it in Genesis 38, verse 8, Leviticus 18, verse 16, and then we see it in the story of Ruth, both in chapter 3, verse 9, and chapter 3, 12 through 13. So it's very important. And if this law is not followed, then the widow is actually allowed to summon the elders and make herself free from the familial obligation to her husband's family. So this is really a big deal. And with the understanding of resurrection, then this question the Sadducees have starts to sound a little crazy, but at the same time, if they're still practicing this Levirate law, then what does that mean in the resurrection? So Jesus, instead of having a debate with them, starts to teach them in verse 34. So he talks about the role of marriage and childbearing for Christians. And even that was up for dispute in the early Christian church. So in Luke chapter 2, verse 36 through 37, we hear about it. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 16. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, 15, and chapter 5, 3 through 16. So Luke has Jesus in this exchange being influenced by the understanding that being married and having children is not the key factor for Christians. which is very interesting and a big challenge, because that is exactly what 1 Timothy and 1 Corinthians talks about. It talks about celibacy, and if you need to marry, then do so. But the fact is we don't need to have children to create a lasting memory, because we aren't dead even though our lives end in this world. The resurrection means that there is still continuation. So it's a challenge and it's a struggle for the Sadducees to understand that, since they reject the idea of resurrection at all. So the logic of Jesus' argument is that since those who are raised do not die, neither is there any need for marriage or raising up children. Now, for many of us, that in and of itself is a shocking thing, because if you remember from Genesis, right, we were to go forth and be fruitful and multiply. So it's a big challenge, and it's also a challenge in our society, because our society still anticipates and perpetuates this understanding that one must be married and one must be having children, otherwise somehow your life is less. And I think it's a really interesting thing that Jesus lifts up in here, is that we do not marry and have children to create a legacy and a way to be remembered. That is not what is necessary and not required for participation in the community, nor is it required for your memory in the life of God and in God's creation. So we see in verse 37 and 38, he actually dismisses through his arguments the basis for the Sadducees' question by explaining that life in the resurrection will not simply be a continuation of life as we know it. So part of the challenge that the Sadducees have is they're just assuming that what we have here is just picked up and planted into the resurrection. And Jesus says that's not what it will be. That is not how it will go. So in verses 37 to 38, as I mentioned, the resurrection and the life of the resurrection will be very different. So Jesus then turns to the root of their question, and it's the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. Using the practice of midrashic argument, Jesus grounds the teaching of the resurrection in the writings that are actually accepted by the Sadducees themselves, the laws of Moses. He calls their attention to a familiar story about a burning bush. But rather than quoting the words of the Lord, Luke cites Moses' report of the words. This is in verse 37. Moses is reported as saying he speaks of the Lord as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So Jesus continues with the logic of his argument that hinges on this axiom that God is not a God of the dead, but a God of the living. Therefore, the patriarchs must be in some sense alive to God, or in God. So if we talk about the patriarchs being alive, right, he is the father of God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. And God is not dead. God is not the God of the dead. He is a God of the living. Then they must be living, because that is who we call out to. So Luke concludes this in verses 39 to 40 with an exchange that, might have been a scolding. But instead, it concludes with the scribes, probably around the affirmation of the resurrection, actually saying to Jesus, "Teacher, you have spoken well." Now, this is really interesting because it's the first time that the scribes have given praise to God. And also they share this title, teacher, which the Sadducees had used at the very beginning. to address him. And also then reminds us that Jesus is a teacher in the temple. Whether they liked it or not, the scribes had to honor what Jesus was saying. Now, of course, he concludes in verse 40 that there's an ambiguous they. They no longer ask Jesus anything. And though it seems a bit ambiguous, we don't know if it's referring to the Sadducees who disappear from the narrative at this point, or whether it's actually about the scribes who had just spoken in the previous verse. Needless to say, regardless of who he is referring to, Jesus once again turns away a group of leaders of the people, bested them in a contest of wits, and declared the faithfulness of God. So even though that was a challenge, it wasn't the same type of challenge that we were seeing from the temple leaders, the elders, and the scribes. Those are definitely folks who are out to destroy and undermine the power of Jesus, to make him undesirable with the people. But now we have folks who are ready to hear. Now, Jesus follows up this interaction with the Sadducees and actually the bragging of the scribes to Jesus, saying that he taught well. Jesus now steps forward with a challenge. He brings a challenge before all of those who are listening to him in chapter 20, verses 41 through 44. So Jesus said to them, "How can they say that the Messiah is David's son? For David himself says in the book of Psalms, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool.' David thus calls him Lord, so how can he be his son?" Now this little phrase in and of itself is really kind of confounding. Like, okay, where's the reference? What is this really about? But Luke inserts this particular story into the confrontation of the chief priests and the scribes and the leaders. And this is after they have finally figured out they can't ask him any more questions. They don't know what to do. So there's 4 parts to this little interaction. One is the question, how can they say that the Messiah is David's son? The second is based on the question, and it's stated in the form of a quotation from Scripture, which is actually Psalm 110, verse 1. And then he draws a conclusion from that quotation. David thus calls him being the Messiah, Lord. And 4, a restatement of the question. So how can he be his son? It's actually left open for us to answer and to reflect. This little section is actually to undermine either the argument that the Messiah is the son of David, or the assumptions about the role of the Messiah that accompanies that designation. The center part of this unit, the quotation and conclusion drawn from it, undermines any implication that the Messiah is only David's son. That the Messiah is more than David's son. The Davidic sonship of Jesus is well established in the New Testament and even seen here in the Gospel of Luke. We see it in the genealogy and the birth narrative in Luke chapter 1, verses 27 and 34, in verse 69, in chapter 2, verses 4 and 11, and in chapter 3, and verse 31. They all emphasize Jesus' claim to descend from David through Joseph. So the gospel, and even the gospel of John and Matthew, recognize this tradition and are aware of it. Now Luke keeps this tradition of the Messiah being a descendant or son of David because it has significance. But it is difficult to determine in this section. Questions are directed at critics who denied Jesus' physical lineage, or at those who drew erroneous conclusions from it by attaching certain messianic expectations from the Son of David. So let us think back to this. As this question for the chief priests and the scribes and the leaders of the people who don't want to acknowledge that Jesus is a descendant of David? Or is this the crowd and others in the community who are saying, well, if you're really the Messiah, then you should overthrow the Roman oppressors, that you should establish a new kingdom, that you will lead an army and set us free? I think it's a little both. It answers both. It answers and questions the one who doesn't want to acknowledge Jesus' connection to David, but it also then helps those who are there to say this kingship, this one who will sit at my right hand and make enemies your footstool, is going to do it in a very different way than what they perceive. Luke uses this to represent and clarify Jesus' kingship. It follows his entry into Jerusalem in chapter 18, where Jesus is identified as the Son of David. Jesus is the expected Son of David, but he is more, just as earlier Luke showed that he is more than just a prophet. As the Son of David, however, he will sit at the right hand of God, and in context, his enemies can only be those who are seeking to trap him and kill him, as the earlier Passion predictions have made quite clear. So this phrase, even though it seemed really confusing and confounding, challenges those who don't want to acknowledge Jesus' kingship, but also challenges those who say, well, if you're the Messiah, then this is what you're going to do, and this is how you're going to do it. And remember, every time Jesus predicted his passion, there was resistance and pushback from the disciples. So they even struggled with what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah. Our last story is Jesus denouncing the scribes in chapter 20, verse 45 through 47. So after pushing back about him being the descendant and son of David, Jesus turns on the scribes. In the hearing of all the people, he said to the disciples, "Beware of the scribes, who like to walk around in long robes and love to be greeted with respect in the marketplace, and to have the best seats in the synagogue and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." Now, this is not the first time that Jesus has warned the disciples and the people to watch out for heresies, for those who abuse and exploit others because of their position in society or in the government. Because he does the same things to tax collectors, right? He does it to the Pharisees who say grand prayers about how great they are over someone else. So Jesus is once again warning the people to be on guard against the temptations that even the scribes fall victim to. So there's three things that Jesus condemns the scribes for. 1, their desire for public recognition. 2, their exploitation of widows. And 3, their pretense of piety while praying. And then Jesus gives 3 examples of their desire for public recognition. They walk around in long, ornate robes that convey their social position. They seek the deferential greetings by which others recognize their superior learning and the authority it gives them. And third, they enjoy having the best seats in the synagogue and at dinners. It is social customs that give and accord these privileges to the scribes. But it's not clear that it is not clear that Jesus condemns the privileges given to the scribes. That's really not his concern, though it is a question worth pondering. Instead, he condemns the love of privilege that makes the privilege the object of the scribe's lifestyle. So again, there might be issues around the privilege, but right now Jesus is saying it is their desire to take advantage and seek out those privileges that is to be the concern. So rather than seeking to reverence God in all they do, i.e. Micah chapter 6 verse 8, to do justice and love kindness and walk humbly with God, the scribes seek public recognition of others. Now remember, Jesus has corrected and warned others about seeking places of honor at banquets. That's in chapter 17, verses 7 through 14. And he actually denounced the Pharisees because they loved, quote, to have seats of honor in the synagogue and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces. Chapter 11, verse 43. Now something to note, in the synagogue, the best seats were in the front, facing the assembly, and these seats were normally reserved for the elders and those with the greatest learning. So the reference to the scribes' conduct at dinners leads to the metaphorical references of eating. They covet the seats of honor at dinner, but they eat up widows' houses. And that's a really interesting thought, isn't it? He moves right from being in these places of honor at the banquet, yet devour widows' houses. So Jesus may have had a variety of means of extortion or deceit in mind when he used that idea of devouring up widows' houses. Fitzmyer, one scholar, says that there are 6 possibilities for how the scribes might have abused this reality. 1, the scribes may be accepting payment for legal aid to widows, even though such payment was forbidden. 2, the scribes cheated widows of what was rightly theirs. 3, scribes sponged off the hospitality of these women of little means. 4, scribes mismanaged the property of widows like Anna, who had dedicated themselves to the service of the temple. Or 5, the scribes took large sums of money from credulous old women as a reward from prolonged prayer that they professed to make on the women's behalf. Or 6, scribes took the houses as pledges for debts that could not be paid. So these various suggestions at least confirm that scribes had a number of ways in which they could defraud widows of their livelihood. Now, Jesus did not give any specific means of deceit in his story. But the point Jesus makes is the scribes misused their position and prestige to prey upon the very members of society they were charged with protecting. These were the people that women would go to when they were widowed and were not getting the protection that they needed from their husbands' families, the shelter or care that was due them. And then Jesus makes this third charge of hypocrisy, that they were hypocrites in their sacred practices. So he charges them with not only being pretentious and taking advantage of those that they were supposed to protect, but they also did not pray with true open hearts and minds. Instead, they prayed pretentiously, and they prayed not out of piety, but about being publicly known. Now, perhaps some would say, oh, thank goodness Jesus is not wanting us to offer long prayers, that he should be condemning long-winded prayers. But he's not condemning prayer that is offered truthfully and humbly to God. Instead, he is condemning prayers that are offered to influence others. That we are not to pray to convict or use prayer as a way to manipulate other people, but instead, prayer is our way to sincerely and humbly petition for God's mercy and communicate with God. And then, of course, Jesus closes chapter 20 with verse 47, which is very direct and very hard. They will receive the greater condemnation. Jesus talks about in chapter 12, verse 48, this kind of sliding scale of reward and punishment. And having found the scribes guilty of using their privileged position merely for their own gain and violating the trust placed in them, Jesus warns of the severity of the sentence. Because they are among the privileged who have received much, held great trust, and given great opportunities, they will receive the greater condemnation. That their place actually holds them to a higher standard. Their place as people of the leaders in the faith holds them to care for and protect the other. And when they fail to do that and abuse their role and position, they will be held accountable. And they will stand before God and receive condemnation. That's tough and harsh words for these scribes. And though it is a blanket statement, that does not say that every scribe was a hypocrite or every scribe abused their position. But we know that when people are given authority, there will be those within that realm that will take advantage of it and use it to their own best interest, to feed their egos, to line their own pockets. And unfortunately, church leaders are not exempt from that reality. And Jesus calls all church leaders, whether a pastor, whether a paid staff person, or whether a volunteer who holds a position of authority in the lives of others in the faith, that we too are held accountable to not manage and abuse our position. Those are hard words for all of us. So that concludes chapter 20 of Luke's Gospel. We're going to conclude our session for today. And I want us to go back and see if we heard any of the themes that run throughout Luke's Gospel. So how about God's redemptive purposes? Maybe a little bit in the sense of, the questions about resurrection and what does that mean. But I think also then is this understanding that the Messiah isn't just someone who's going to reestablish this high kingdom of Israel, but is actually calling to create a new kingdom. How about the second, salvation for all alike? I have to say, I didn't hear that in any of our stories today. How about the third, blessings of poverty and the dangers of wealth? I'm not sure we could talk about the dangers of wealth, but I can definitely say that Jesus talked about the danger of authority and the risk of abusing that authority as he denounced the scribes. How about 4, table fellowship? No, that wasn't part of our discussion today. How about 5, the role of a disciple? A little bit. Definitely talks about the fact that marriage and children is not a requirement of discipleship. That whether we are called to marry or to have children is not a make or break in our faithfulness to God. And how about 6, the importance of an accurate witness? I would say not at this point. I don't believe that was part of what Luke was trying to convey in the story today. So again, we are concluding our study here. In our next episode, we will begin chapter 21. Jesus continues to teach in the temple. And we hear the story of the widow's offering in chapter 21, verses 1 through 4. Jesus foretelling the destruction of the temple in verses 5 through 6. Jesus giving signs and warning of persecutions in verses 7 through 19. And then Jesus foretelling the destruction of Jerusalem in verses 20 through 24. Thank you for joining me. Again, as I mentioned, if you have any questions or reflection, please include them in the comments below. You're welcome to post them there. If you would prefer to keep it more of a private conversation, you're welcome to reach out to me via email. You can also contact me through my social media pages. You'll see those just here shortly at the end of the video. Grace and peace to you, my dear Theophilus. God is with you.